Hi, folks. I want to talk about organizational culture. And I want to preface it first with an understanding that if we're going to change or work on organizational culture, organizations don't happen in isolation to the systems that they operate in, right? So what's happening around us in the world, what's happening in the communities and the economic system and the social system that organizations operate in. And and oftentimes we are compelled or motivated to look at our organizational culture prompted by crisis or maybe a big change in leadership or the perception of our organization by community or stakeholders or shareholders as distrustful. And so oftentimes there's a motivation for looking at our organization and thinking about how might we change the organization. So organizations have culture, and culture is really complex. So culture is made up of layers. So there's the things that we see and that we can point to. So it can be things like your strategic plan, our vision, our mission, our values. People sometimes think that our strategic plan is the evidence of our culture. It's not. It's just one indicator or one artifact of the culture. There can be the things that we can see can be things like, the buildings we operate out of, or how we identify people who work for the organization, or the location in the communities that we exist in or that we operate in. Then there's a layer that's about how we operate. So it can be things like the titles, the positions, the roles people play, how the hierarchy operates in the organization, maybe who has power and what actions we prioritize, so that kind of rise to the top that seem to take the most energy, effort, and resources. So that's two layers, the things we see and the ways we operate. But then the third layer is about the things we believe. So who speaks and who doesn't get to speak, right? Whose voices are amplified, whose voices are marginalized, how we interact with each other, the actual behaviors we demonstrate when we work together or work with each other. The state of conflict and the organization, the state of relationships. So all those things reflect the things we believe, the stories that we tell ourselves that actually become real and true. When we put all those things together, that becomes the real indicator, so the real artifacts of the culture that we have. So, how do you transform your organizational culture to get a culture that is a peak performing organization where you have high employee retention, where you're creative and innovative and problem solving? There's loads of research out there on what it takes to have those kinds of organizations. And sometimes the crisis motivates the change for transformation in the organization. So, I've got 8 steps for you that can help you transform your organization. But I want to be clear, they're not linear. So I'm just offering them as one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, because that helps us, helps you kind of put the pieces of the pie. But I actually want you to think about them like pieces of a pie, and they go together. They have to all work together. So I'm going to give you a couple of those pieces, and then you can read my blog for the rest of it. So number one, you need to map out the real culture you have now, not the one that's in your strategic plan or that's in your mission or vision or values, not the one that is in your annual report. What's the real culture of your organization? And you want to harvest the stories, the experiences, the beliefs, the values, the ways of interaction, the actions that are actually happening in the organization. And we want to do that through stories and experiences because they can highlight the essence of what's the real culture, the real things that are happening, and those 3 layers of cultures: the things we see, the ways we operate, and the things we believe. So we do that by asking questions. And we can ask questions like, what's a story that highlights the essence of your experience with the organization? Or what's a word or a phrase or an image that brings to light your experience of the organization? Now, we want to ask them of people in the organization, but we also want to ask them of people in the system. So, in the community around it, stakeholders and shareholders, other parts of the system the organization interacts with, because they're all going to bring their perceptions, and that will tell the real story of the culture. Now, you might be tempted in this first step to bring people together to have a conversation about what's the culture of our organization now. And, as someone who's facilitates these conversations, it just feels like it would be a great workshop. It would be a great community conversation. They want to offer some caution. If you have a conflict or a culture of, fear or repercussion, of tension or conflict, of really challenging power dynamics, if you've got a perception of distrust or any of those kinds of things are present, bringing people together at this early stage to talk about what's the culture we have now could actually reinforce some serious challenges. And it could reinforce the status quo of the norms and the ways we operate rather than kickstart a different way of working. So I want to just caution you on that front and maybe recommend interviews or surveys. Now, we need to gather data that gathers those stories, but the data has to mean something. And so we want to ask ourselves, what does the stories tell us when we've conducted interviews and surveys, which takes me to point number 2. You want to map the results against the evidence of high performing cultures because then it means something. It tells you, oh, this organization is experiencing this, and look at that. That's a strength we need to leverage. Or this organization is having this happen, and that turns out to be a challenge and the opposite kind of behaviors or actions that we want to cultivate in a high performing culture. So, in my blog, I've given you lots of resources. And of course, there's loads of research out there on what creates high performing cultures. But I've specifically referenced the work of Daniel Cole and his Culture Code book, or Daniel Goleman and his work in emotional intelligence related to individual leadership characteristics that are present in high performing cultures. Otto Schormer and his work on how we interact with each other and the system and transform society and organizations and individuals. Even Harrison Owen and his work related to structure and flexibility and the role of leaders in getting out of the way in order to generate problem solving. So there's some resources for you, but we want to take what we've learned and have it make sense and really make meaning from the stories, right? This is what it tells us about what we really have right now, and maybe what we're lacking and what we need to grow. So number 3 is you need to build individual capacity. So system change happens when individuals transform and take action to change the system. And so we want to build individual capacity. We want to grow leadership skills, to collaborate, to listen, to influence, to decide, to communicate, to build self-awareness and self-regulation, to have clarity on our leadership commitment and vision. And I'm using words leadership. And so you might think, oh, well, that's just for the leadership team, but it's not only for formal leaders. We need to grow the internal, lead your own life, lead yourself kind of energy, skills, and competencies of everyone in the system that is operating in order to create that change. Now, we don't do this by itself. We do this in connection with number 4, which is to build the collective capacity of the group. So we're growing and learning and developing and improving individuals and how they operate, and we're bringing them together into groups to have the conversation. So we're building collective capacity, and it's a bit like a dance, right? So we grow self, and then we expand the experience of the group in new ways of interacting because each individual has grown and developed. And then we apply that learning from the group interaction and experience back to self. And then we enhance and create new group norms by bringing the group back together. And we do it again and again and again. So that individual capacity, which is number 3, and that build the collective experience and capacity, which is number 4, they go hand in hand. We just keep doing that because we're not just exploring what the new culture looks like, we're actually modeling and experiencing a new culture as we're growing it. It's like, build the path that we're walking on as we move forward. So number 5, and this is the last one I'll go through, and then I'm going to encourage you to read the rest of my blog for the other points about how to transform organizations, is that we want to weave a vision of a new evolving cultural landscape. And oftentimes we think, well, we got to write the plan. What's the new culture that we want? And then we'll implement it. But culture change isn't linear. And so if we build a plan at the beginning, we may not have the capacity, the competency, the skills, even the ability to imagine something different until we've done some of the individual work and some of the collective work. So we build it after we've done some of that collective. What do we imagine we want instead of what we already have, especially once you've got that clarity on what have we got right now? What do we want instead? Because every organization, and based on their mandate and their experience and their relationships, are going to want something different to transform into that higher performing, creative, innovative place. And so culture change is messy. It doesn't go in a straight line. It, goes three steps forward, one step back, two steps sideways. People, cling to sometimes the what's familiar and what they know, even if it doesn't serve them. Sometimes they cling to what's familiar and what they do know, because it does serve them, gives them power, influence, or identity. Some folks rush forward and shine a light on the new vision, the new, tapestry of what culture could be, and they're a beacon for all of us. Sometimes old patterns rise as we hit challenges and difficulties along the way. And so we don't start with the vision because we won't have the capacity for the conversation. We start with the individual capacity, the clarity on what we have right now, and then we bring the group together to experience and imagine what can come next. So read my blog for the other points on how to transform culture. And remember, even it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I want you to think about it each as a piece of pie, because we got to do them all sort of together at the same time, not one check the box and we move forward. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. I'd love to hear your comments. Take care.